Epigenetics is a fabulous, incredibly interesting and exciting aspect of biology. Epigenetics is the way that our bodies, our cells regulate gene expression. It's a highly conserved, highly precise way of altering the way we express our genes. If you sort of think of your DNA as the hardware, then the epigenome is the software. It's how we all have the same DNA in all of our cells, and yet we have cell types that are very different.
This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and on this episode, my co-host Anastasia Janas and I have a fascinating conversation with Dr. Catherine Stehman-Breen, the former CEO of Chroma Medicine. Dr. Stehman-Breen is currently an advisor to the new entity in Chroma Medicine and was a CEO at Chroma until it merged with NVelop Therapeutics in January. She is an Atlas Ventures advisor and former entrepreneur in residence, and she serves as a board member at Dyne Therapeutics, Tenaya Therapeutics, and Generation Bio. Catherine was previously the chief medical officer at Disarm Therapeutics and Dyne Therapeutics. And before that, she was the chief medical officer at Sarepta Therapeutics, which focuses on genetic medicines. Prior to Sarepta, she was vice president of clinical development at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. She also served as vice president of global development at Amgen, leading several therapeutic areas. Catherine earned her medical degree from the University of Chicago. She completed her residency and nephrology fellowship training at the University of Washington, where she also received a Master's of Science in Epidemiology. She served as a faculty member in the Division of Nephrology and remains an affiliate associate professor in the School of Public Health with more than 90 publications in medical journals. Dr. Stehman-Breen has been a supporter of Nucleate, and she teaches a fantastic Nucleate Translate session on unmet needs and indication selection. We are including a link in the show notes for your reference, especially for the entrepreneurs in our audience. We are grateful to have her as an engaged expert in our Nucleate community, and we hope you enjoy the episode.
So thank you for joining the Nucleate Podcast, Catherine.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
We are looking forward to the conversation and learning more about you and also your career. Before we kick off, let's start at the beginning. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, where you grew up, and your early childhood?
So I grew up outside of Chicago in one of the Chicago suburbs. Growing up there, I honestly thought it was the most boring place on earth and desperately wanted to get out of the suburbs and get out of the Midwest. In retrospect, I had a fantastic education and an upbringing in the suburbs of Chicago. My mom started out as a school teacher and then an antique dealer. My dad worked in banking. I didn't really have anybody in my family that was in healthcare other than a much older cousin. And so I didn't really have any healthcare influences from that perspective. But I had a relatively uneventful childhood. My mom being an antique dealer, we used to pack the car up when school got out, drive out to Maine in the summer, spend the summer there, and pack back up with a van full of antiques at the end of the summer. And so I did have sort of this interesting life growing up where I had my school life that went for about 9 months of the year, and then I had a summer life that lasted for the remainder of the year. And back at that time, there wasn't social media. If you were communicating with people, it was typically with letters. So you really had this very dichotomous life that was a pretty cool experience. And actually, some of my very oldest friends are from my summers that I spent in Maine.
It's fantastic. When did you decide that you want to pursue a career in medicine?
So I suppose you would say I decided I was going to have a career in medicine when I was very, very small. When people would ask young children what they wanted to be when they grew up, they might be a fireman. I always said I was going to be a doctor. I never really changed that decision that apparently I had made at a very young age. And my education just followed that path. And so because I had decided at an early age that's what I wanted to do, I ended up taking a heavier course load in science and in high school, but then also in college. I was a double major in biology and psychology. At one point, I thought I would be a psychiatrist. I ultimately decided not to become a psychiatrist, but I always had an interest in human behavior throughout college and into the early part of medical school.
That's very interesting, especially your younger self somehow had this idea of you becoming a doctor, and then your older self still said, oh, that's something that I'm gonna do and I'm gonna pursue and be happy with this. It's very fascinating. So you mentioned that you want to become a psychiatrist, but you ended up going to internal medicine. Could you explain a little bit more what, like, how did you decide to do that?
Yeah, I think for many of us, a lot of life is influenced by the people that you end up getting exposed to during your education. So during college, I spent a lot of time in the psychology department. I actually spent a lot of time in research methods and taught research methods in the psychology department. And so I was very influenced by my mentors in that department. And so you tend to gravitate towards fields where you are influenced by people that you respect. Um, of course, then you go on to medical school and residency. And in medical school, my strongest experience and the people I was most influenced by and what I was most drawn to was my rotations in internal medicine. I think with internal medicine, you get a very broad exposure across a very wide range of diseases, across many tissues. And I was quite attracted to the ability to touch that many diseases that a patient might have, and being able to address what for most patients ends up being a cluster of diseases, and having that expertise to be able to help patients across that range of disease that they may have been touched by. I ultimately ended up being most influenced during my residency by a nephrologist who I deeply respected. I also really enjoyed the physiology. Nephrology makes sense. It's somewhat quantitative, less, I suppose there's still a fair amount of art to the science. But it was something I was drawn to both from the subject matter, but also the people that I was influenced by. It's also an area, nephrology, where, particularly end-stage renal disease, where people have a range of metabolic diseases. And so again, you're touching a lot of different specialties. You get a lot of exposure to endocrinology, to cardiology. And so it ends up, although you're focusing on one particular specialty, you're actually touching a very wide range of diseases, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Also, internal medicine is, kind of you are the Dr. House, kind of the person who knows it all, and who is super particularly looking into every detail and makes sense out of it. So, a huge respect to that.
Yeah, no, I like puzzles. I've always liked solving puzzles regardless of where they fall in life. I like tackling problems and trying to make things better. And so specialties from the broad internal medicine to a subspecialty in nephrology was an area that allowed me to do that in the way that you just described.
Yeah, and at what point did you decide that you are leaving and that you pivot into biotech and industry?
Yeah, so I would characterize my career as not being terribly intentional. I didn't start out saying I'm going to go be a CEO someday, or I'm going to be a, I don't know, chief medical officer, or go into industry. I've um I've really been influenced by opportunities that intrigue me, where I think I can make a difference. I never imagined I would end up in industry. I trained as a nephrologist as part of my nephrology training. I also trained as an epidemiologist, and I was happily doing epidemiologic research at University of Washington with the team that I had built. I I got contacted by a recruiter at some point who was extremely persistent, and my medical liaison at some point said, well, why don't you go down to Amgen and visit? You know, you don't need to take the job, but it might be just an interesting experience. So I was like, all right, it's, a couple hour flight. And I remember visiting very, very distinctly. And I remember there was this sense of optimism. There were a lot of really smart people. I have no idea who I thought worked at pharmaceutical companies, but it was a group of people that were incredibly talented. And they had a singular goal to solve difficult biologic problems in an effort to make therapeutics that were going to make a difference in people's lives. And I really appreciated this singular goal and singular focus, um, and the collaboration that you saw across the entire company to achieve that goal. Um, I also really appreciated, and I came to appreciate this much more after I got to Amgen, was this nexus between the business of making drugs and science and taking care of patients, doing something really great for patients. People often say when you work in, as a physician, when you work in at a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, you have this opportunity to influence the disease path of a very large number of people in a way that allows you to give or provide new tools to physicians. It's different than what you do in clinical practice, where you're working one-on-one with patients and making an incredibly important contribution and influencing patients in a very meaningful way. Um, but you do realize that you have this ability to really influence the course of disease for many, many people. And it can be very fulfilling. It's also an enormous weight on your shoulders. When you're running clinical trials, I mean, that's the other thing. You think when you go and you work in pharma that you're no longer going to feel this connection with patient care. But what happens when you're running clinical trials is you're getting data in all the time, and it's anonymized with regard to patients, but you're making decisions about individual patients, but also large groups of patients as you're determining the direction of the clinical trial. You get an adverse event that comes in, and you're trying to pull as much information about this individual patient. It's almost like a remote consult. And you're making really important decisions about whether it is a true event associated with the drug. You're working in a lot of ambiguity, and you realize you have this tremendous weight on your shoulders, where you're making decisions that will determine, to some extent, can determine whether a drug will move forward, whether it won't move forward, and you're doing it in a lot of ambiguity. You don't want to be overly conservative or overly liberal in your assessments, because if you discount something in your best judgment, it could have a negative impact on patients. But the reverse is also true. If you're too conservative, then many patients may not ultimately benefit from the drug. And so it ultimately ends up being a very significant medical responsibility, all of the decisions that you make. And so you still feel very connected to patients in that way and many others. And so for me, it's been very fulfilling to be able to feel like I've had an impact on patients in a broad sort of way, but still feel close to patients. And you probably feel the closeness to patients the most when you're running clinical trials, or if you're working in certain areas like rare disease.
It's very interesting, the perspective, because when you are attending medical school, you have this, kind of this option of going to pharma, and some physicians are very negative about that, or they're, kind of they have certain concerns about that. And
Yeah.
as you said, kind of saying, oh, you aren't a physician anymore, you aren't treating
Yeah.
patients anymore, you
Yeah.
aren't making any difference. So it's very interesting to hear your perspective. And actually, it's not true. You are super involved and very, very, a very important piece in this whole puzzle.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I've had people say that to me before, not even just physicians, just friends, because I think there's an underappreciation for um, how deeply you are involved in patient care in a different sort of way, in a focused way, it relates to executing a clinical trial. So, and I think most people, most physicians that go into industry are going into industry because they want to do something that will be meaningful to patients.
What would you say were the best, or how did your career in medicine prepare you for your career in industry and what you're ultimately doing now?
Yeah, so I've always told people that are physicians that join industry, when you join industry, about 20% of what you learned is valuable to joining industry. And there's a whole like 80% of stuff that you end up needing to learn once you join industry. But that 20% of what you know and what you bring to the table ends up being really important. There's the obvious subject matter expertise in disease. There's the ability to very quickly and effectively learn about a new disease. There is something that's a bit intangible in the fluency that you have if you've taken care of patients, to have a deep sense and fluency in what you believe will be meaningful to physicians and patients. I think that comes, as I said, from having taken care of patients and having been in that industry and in the industry of taking care of patients. But I think there's some other fundamental skills that you bring to the table. If you've been through medical school and residency, you've had to work long hours without much complaint. You have to be extremely stoic, and you have to be able to multitask. You absolutely need to be able to work in ambiguity. These are all skills that aren't necessarily, all completely teachable, but there are many of these skills are skills that you just acquire as you've gone through that training. And so when you join, um, a pharmaceutical company, most people that are physicians, they just know how to jump in. They don't necessarily point at something and say that's broken. They go fix it, because that's what they do as physicians. You jump in and diagnose a problem, create a plan to solve that problem, and execute on that plan, follow up on that plan, adjust the plan. These are fundamental skills that, if you're a successful physician, will make you successful in many things that you do. It's problem solving and ambiguity.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, kind of as physician, you are so analytical because you have a set of symptoms and you have to make sure, or like you have to find a way how to find out if it's true or not and what to do with this. So I would
Yeah,
imagine that it helps a lot when
yeah.
you other areas.
You're used to asking a lot of questions. Some of them, you're used to asking questions often that feel like they might even be a dumb question to ask, but you're used to probing and being pretty fearless in doing so. And again, those are skill sets that end up being very transferable to a wide range of of things that you do, including working at a pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, so you spent a time at the pharmaceutical company at Amgen, and I would just make a small jump to what you're doing now, Chroma Medicine. And first of all, for our listeners who are not very kind of familiar with epigenetic editing, could you maybe explain us what this is?
Yeah, so epigenetics is a fabulous, incredibly interesting and exciting aspect of biology. So epigenetics is the way that our bodies, our cells regulate gene expression. It's a highly conserved, highly precise way of altering the way we express our genes. If you sort of think of your DNA as the hardware, then the epigenome as the software. It's how we all have the same DNA in all of our cells, and yet we have cell types that are very different. It's incredibly important during differentiation. We wouldn't have our organs if it weren't for epigenetics. But it also is very important during our life. It is a stable system where that is driven by a variety of different mechanisms, but one of the mechanisms is methylation, DNA methylation. And so if you have differences in the amount of DNA methylation you have in one gene versus in one gene versus another, it will alter the amount of expression of that gene. And so highly methylated genes are silent and unmethylated genes are active. And so Chroma took advantage of this incredible evolution and altered gene expression by altering the methylome, by altering the amount of methylation at a particular gene and a particular locus on a gene. And so by altering the methylation, leveraging a lot of the tools that have been developed for gene editing, we were able to very specifically alter gene expression. And in doing so, you can alter the course of disease.
It's very, very interesting and very elegant. So ultimately, you are making sure that a gene is expressed in one way or another without actually cutting the genome. So
Yeah.
with it.
I kind of think of it in a very simplistic way. If you're comparing it to gene editing, there's many ways of stopping a car. You can bash your car into a light post. That car will stop, but the horns will be blaring and the lights may be blinking, and you might not be able to get your car going again. Or you can simply put your foot on the brake. And if you use the system that was designed to regulate gene expression, it's elegant and has the potential to be a safer and more effective way of regulating gene expression.
One question to just jump in here is, do you expect this kind of therapeutic to be, potentially permanent? Because that is one of the aspects of, gene therapy that's very positive, and obviously this is like an editor type of approach. So just curious about the durability of this kind of therapy.
Yeah, the data that has been generated to date suggests that it's durable, that it is a one and done approach. It was a question that we got often when we were asked about the use or leveraging the epigenetics for durable treatments. It probably isn't a great surprise that if you methylate a gene, that it will be durable. It is from a biology standpoint, if methylation wasn't durable, we would have cellular chaos. And we, it's just a highly conserved mechanism. I think the data that's been generated by Chroma now and Chroma and others are really supporting the durability, including data that was generated using a partial hepatectomy model where you essentially remove part of the liver, it regenerates, and even after you regenerate the liver, you see these same changes in gene expression, demonstrating that it's not just durable for the life of a cell, but it's also durable through cell division. A super elegant, really interesting system.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation. And what would we also like to know is basically you as a CEO, what were your thought processes on deciding what to do, which first target to pursue? But before we jump into that, let's start with the story how you joined Chroma. And it was a phone call from David Liu, who actually basically told you, do you want to become a CEO of this company? So could you explain us or how you felt in this moment and what were your thought processes by deciding whether to do that or not?
Yeah, so I had been thinking about taking a CEO role, and there were a number of boxes that I felt needed to be checked in deciding what company that I would like to join. Certainly, having David Liu reach out and ask if I might be interested in taking a CEO role at Chroma Medicine checks one box, i.e., a great set of founders with a proven track record in the space with really exciting needle moving science. And so there were a few things that I was particularly interested in thinking through what company would make the most sense in taking a CEO role. Um, it absolutely needed to be in a space where I thought it was going to make a profound difference or had the potential to make a profound difference in patients' lives. Something that was differentiated and differentiated from gene editing, as you pointed out. This definitely checked that box. It was a way of regulating gene expression without cutting or nicking the DNA. It was durable, so it had the curative potential. I also was interested in joining a company from the ground up. I'd never done that. I'd done it a little bit when I spent some time as an entrepreneur in residence at Atlas and really enjoyed and appreciated the ability to join a company almost at inception, where you're making those foundational decisions that ultimately end up being really important in determining the ultimate success of the company. But it's also a time point at which you're telling the story of the company for the first time. And I really like and appreciate storytelling. I also wanted to work in an area where we were telling a new story, not a twist on a story that had been told before. So, not a gene editor that did a little something different, or I don't know, a DNA binding domain that was a little bit different, but a completely new approach to genomic medicine and a new way of regulating gene expression. And I really appreciated the elegance of telling that story. And it frankly has been one of the really fun parts of watching Chroma grow is from inception when we first started telling what the promise of regulating gene expression through epigenetics was, having to do some education on epigenetics in the context of genomic medicine and what that system and how that system works, building a biology story through a lot of the data that we generated. Um, and then watching over time people not really asking, is it durable, or is what is the benefit of using epigenetics, but really then being more forward thinking and being able to tell that story for the first time was great. It also was important to me to have a strong set of investors, those that had prior experience in building companies. It's a lot of work building a platform company and not necessarily for the faint of heart. And so you really want to make sure that you've got strong backing in doing so. I also knew Vic Meyer, who was our CSO and who joined the company at about the same time. And so it was fun joining a company with somebody that I knew, where we'd had the opportunity to work together prior to Chroma and had similar ideas in terms of company building.
It sounds very interesting, especially as I said, yeah, you wanted to have this challenge of building a company from the beginning up. But I'm curious, how were the first days? Like, could you explain us? So you took the role, you are the CEO of a company that has a lot of potential. So what did you do in the
Yeah.
first days?
Well, first you need to make sure you've got some money in the bank. So that's always an important first thing to do. But in all seriousness, the first thing that you really start to do is build the strategy and the story. It you As I said, you need to make sure that you've got the funding that you need to be able to do the work, but you need to be able to tell a story of the promise of the company and of the technology and why investors should hand you money to move something forward. You spend a fair amount of time doing that in the beginning, and it's a great bonding experience with an early team. And if you like working in ambiguity and telling stories, it's a really fun process. You also have to start thinking about, who do we need at the company? I think when I joined, it was maybe I don't know, the sixth employee, and it was during COVID, so we were all remote, and we really had a pretty small team at that point, and so you're building your strategy, you're trying to understand what resources you're going to need, what people and capabilities you're going to need, and a philosophic approach to how you're going to move forward. The world is, available. You can decide you're going to do something very risky biologically. You can decide you're going to focus on a single tissue. You're going to focus on a couple of tissues. Genomic medicine has many parts to it. Where are you going to get your delivery capability from? What capabilities are you going to have in house? What capabilities are you going to bring in externally? And so there's a large number of decisions that you have to make early on that ultimately influence the direction of the company moving forward.
Yeah, so it's a lot of decisions, a lot of very fun, a lot of fun doing that. But I would also think a lot of weight for these decisions, because basically if you decide in one way or another, you decide the fate of the company. So how did you go on with that?
Well, having a strong team always helps with these things. And so, we had a group of founders that had deep experience in genomic medicine. We had many people, early on, and as we hired people that had deep experience in genomic medicine. And genomic medicine is still in its early days, but there's a little bit more of a playbook than there was, 5 or 10 years ago. And so, early on, there's certain capabilities that you really should build in-house. There's others that are a bit more commoditized that you can, acquire elsewhere. We spent a lot of time early on thinking about our indication selection. It's really important early on to try to get that right. It's hard in a platform company because what you're doing early on is proving that your technology works. In proving your technology works, you want to have as few variables that are unknowns as possible, so that as you're manipulating your technology, you have clear markers of what that means from a biology standpoint. And so, you typically pick indications early on where there's tissues that you can deliver to, and genes where you understand the biology reasonably well. It is truthfully, I think, one of the biggest challenges in genomic medicine right now, because we're limited by delivery. And so there's a lot of clustering of genetic medicines in the liver, to a large extent in also in the CNS, and for ex vivo approaches in immune cells. But it means that a lot of companies are the same sort of general strategy of, I need to show my technology works. I need to also move something forward that's differentiated and tells a story about the technology, which is truthfully, it's one of the hardest things that you end up doing as an early company, is trying to find what that perfect initial indication is that's going to thread the needle between achieving validation of the technology, but also validating that you've got a differentiated, important therapeutic approach.
Jumping in here, you teach a whole lecture for Nucleate, and we'll link that for our audience so they can listen in detail about the thoughts on indication selection, the frameworks you use. I am curious, though, you ultimately chose hepatitis B and D for Chroma, now N-Chroma's lead indication. And I thought that was interesting because it's a relatively underappreciated area, infectious disease, right? Gilead had a therapeutic for hepatitis C, but since then there have been fewer curative infectious disease approaches. And I would say, from what I've been seeing in the venture world, through my experience at Locust Walk, there's more of an emphasis on neurological diseases and autoimmune diseases, and infectious disease has just not been appreciated and valued as much. So I'm curious how or why hepatitis B and D rose to the top of your indication selection thought process.
Yeah, so there's a huge amount of unmet medical need. There are millions of patients across the globe that have chronic hepatitis B. It's associated with significant morbidity, mortality, and it's been a tough one to tackle. There have been some inroads into hepatitis B, at least in keeping at bay with the nucleoside analogs, but curative treatments like Hep C used to be have been elusive. It is also uniquely differentiated for the technology. And so when you get asked that question, what can you do that no one else can do, or no one else can do nearly as well as you can do? This is clearly an indication that answers that question, or that addresses that question. Hepatitis B is a tricky virus. It's exists in two forms in the cells. It integrates into the DNA, but there's also the circular DNA, that's the episomal DNA. The epigenetic technology allows you to be able to target both the CCC DNA and the integrated virus. It's the CCC DNA that makes virus, but it's the integrated virus that it doesn't actually make virus. It makes hepatitis B surface antigen, which is thought to be immunosuppressive and is thought to create the immune system dysfunction that results in many patients being unable to clear the virus. And so what you can do with this technology is methylate both the CCC DNA, but also the integrated virus. When you methylate both forms of the virus, you make the cells, the virus in the cells, functionally inactive. And so if you think about other approaches, like, for example, an siRNA or an ASO, while you're taking the drug, you're holding the disease at bay. But as soon as you discontinue the drug, the cells that remain just start making virus again, which is a pretty big lift for the immune system to achieve a functional cure, which is required for an approval. And a functional cure requires that your viral and your hepatitis B surface antigen levels are below detection. And so by essentially cloaking the virus and making it functionally inactive, it's a much more reasonable lift for the immune system to clear the very few cells that remain that might still have virus. It's that durability of this epigenetic approach that allows you to do that. If you're using an siRNA or an ASO, you're essentially having to withdraw therapy. But because this technology is durable, that silencing remains for the life of a cell, and again, through cell division. So it's a beautiful, very elegant way of treating hepatitis B. And I think if there is an approach that has the potential to drive functional cures to a clinically meaningful level, it's using epigenetics and using epigenetic editors. And I think Chroma has done a fantastic job of building a very highly potent and effective construct. And I'm really excited to watch as ultimately the clinical trial data unfold.
You mentioned that you silence basically two targets. Is it a one-time treatment, or do you have to have one treatment for one target and then another one for the second one?
Yeah, so no, the single treatment will target both the CCC and the integrated virus at the same time. One of the nice things about epigenetic editing is you can use it once, and whatever you edit, theoretically, wherever you methylate, will theoretically be durable for the life of the cell and through cell division. But you have the option of being able to redose. And so what would redosing be valuable for? It could be valuable if you wanted to bring down the dose so that you could split a dose. And certainly tolerability has been an area of focus in genomic medicine when you're delivering, when you're delivering with a lipid nanoparticle or AAV. But delivering with a lipid nanoparticle allows you to be able to redose. And so it can allow you to split the dose, but it can also allow you to redose in the context of hepatitis B. So if you wanted to test whether or not dosing a second time may allow you to edit those few remaining cells that may not have been edited during that first dose, you have that option of being able to do that. But it's not for durability. We really truly believe that once you methylate a gene, it remains methylated for the life of the cell and through cell division.
And with the current iteration of the treatment, is that via a viral nanoparticle or a lipid nanoparticle, since you mentioned both? Or do you think both are potential delivery vehicles as you move forward?
Yeah, you could, well, so to the liver, you would deliver with a lipid nanoparticle, but there are other ways of delivering, and including with AV or other viral approaches.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Now, we've been alluding to the, new company Chroma, which is a merger between Chroma Medicine with NVelop Therapeutics. So I'm curious to hear what motivated the merger, what the new company is going to look like moving forward. And this just happened in January, so relatively recent.
Yeah, no, I think I mentioned early on when we were talking about genomic medicine, one of the biggest, probably, is probably a couple big barriers to genomic medicine, but one of the truly the biggest barriers is being able to deliver outside of the liver or CNS. So to the tissues that we can deliver in today, there's a huge number of patients that are afflicted with a range of diseases that cannot benefit from genetic medicines today. And so the ability to bring together a really exciting payload with a really exciting novel delivery technology um, allows you the opportunity to be able to tackle many of those diseases which have been unaddressable to date. So I think it makes a lot of sense from a therapeutic standpoint. I know Jeff Walsh well from I sit on a board with him. I have a deep amount of respect for him. He's now the CEO of Chroma, and I think we sat down together in late September sometime and started talking about whether or not it might make some sense to begin a discussion about bringing the two companies together. We had some overlapping investors, which makes it a little bit easier because they're obviously already committed to both companies, and spent quite a lot of time between the two companies, thinking and exploring each other's company to understand whether or not bringing these technologies could make the combination of the two greater than each one alone. So I think it's a hugely exciting opportunity for both Chroma and for NVelop to come together as a single company to do what I think is going to be some amazing, build some amazing drugs for patients.
That's great. And, building off that, when you're thinking about the future for epigenetic editing broadly, not just limited to Chroma, where do you think, the next diseases beyond, hepatitis B and D, what kind of indications do you think would be potentially eligible for a therapy like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think so there's other liver indications that could be interesting. One of the unique opportunities with epigenetic editing is to be able to multiplex or target more than one gene at a time. We know that most diseases are more complicated than a single gene, and so being able to target multiple genes has advantages there. There's also people that have a combination of different drivers of the end disease that they have. There's multiple pathways that are playing a role in driving an increased risk of disease. And so, again, being able to target more than one gene is, I think, incredibly promising for having a very meaningful impact on disease progression. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities there. Certainly, the CNS, delivering to the CNS is another area that we had explored in the past. It's obviously difficult to deliver to two different tissues with two different technologies early on in the life of a company, but certainly lots of interesting opportunities there. Immune cells, another area where where there's, I think, remains still a lot of opportunity where multiplexing can play a very important role. HSCs, I think the opportunities are a little bit limitless if you can deliver to a range of tissues.
So I guess to the point of the merger is that if you have a really good delivery technology, that you have many different organ types, disease types that would be eligible for epigenetic editing.
Yeah, I think the key is to do prioritization, as we all must do in small biotechs, and try to match up the two technologies with tissues and diseases for which the probability of success is high and the impact is also high.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And most of our discussion so far has been around methylation and inhibiting gene expression. I'm curious if you also see the application for increasing gene expression for other different disease types. To my knowledge, it's possible, but curious if you had any previous work on that.
Yeah, Chroma's done some work and has some data that's been presented publicly and probably still remains on the website. Silencing is more straightforward and less nuanced than activation. I think there's a lot of promise in activation, and it's certainly another area where if you say, what can this technology do that other editing technologies can't do, this is a big opportunity, whether you're activating a gene, a single gene, or combining silencing and activating together. It is, if you kind of think about silence a gene as putting your foot on the brake, activating is a little bit more like taking your foot off the brake. You need to have the other cellular machinery available in order for that gene to be expressed. And so it may end up being a little bit more gene dependent. Um, and a bit more nuanced, but I certainly think there's a huge amount of opportunity in developing the activation technology further and also combining it with silencing.
Now, I wanted to pivot a little bit in terms of what's next for you. So I know you're going to remain an advisor to Chroma as it moves forward. I know you're on the board of several really interesting companies, and you're in the
Yeah.
IR at Atlas. So just curious what the future holds for you now that you're moving forward.
Yeah, I'll, continue to help Chroma in any way I can as Chroma transitions into the clinic. And again, really excited to see where the technology goes. It's been really fun flipping really interesting preclinical cards over, and I can't wait to ultimately see the clinical cards flip. Um, right now, I'm having a lot of fun spending time with some of the companies that I'm on the board of and being able to help tackle other important problems and decisions that need to be made as the companies continue to move forward, and exploring opportunities where ultimately I feel like I can make a difference. It's just an incredible time to be in drug development. If this were 20 years ago, we'd be thinking, oh, maybe there's small molecules or maybe cutting edge antibodies. But today, there's just this enormous range of technologies that have been unfolding that have the opportunity to really meaningfully change the lives of patients. There's so much genomic medicine that's been, or genomic data that's been generated that's also driving a deeper understanding of where to go from a therapeutic standpoint. Biology is better understood. And so it's right now, it's just a fun time to be exploring what's out there and what that next place is that I think is going to change the way that physicians treat patients.
Fantastic. And yeah, I definitely noticed that through line, from the earlier part of the conversation is that while you've left clinical practice, that, the patients at the end of the day are core to what you do in the biotech world, whether it's through Enchroma or as a, chief medical officer, et cetera. So it's really refreshing to hear that because I think it's unique to have that, clinical perspective, that patient focused perspective. Everybody does, like, who's in the industry obviously is focused on patients at the end of the day, but actually having taken care of patients, I think offers a very valuable perspective, even from the earlier stages of development. Like what is the application of this therapy? How is it going to impact patients at the end of the day?
I think for most physicians, I think, I suppose I've never really asked, but certainly for me, anytime I'm thinking about a therapeutic or a potential application of a technology, I think about patients that I've treated. And that's always in my mind. You often have visuals of people that you've come into contact with over the years. And sometimes it's patients that you've treated in the clinic, sometimes it's people that but it's that framework of, again, what is the unmet medical need? What would truly make a difference in their lives from their perspective? And it really drives what you feel passionately about and what you advocate for.
Definitely. And it's funny you mentioned unmet medical needs because it's one of the things I've been thinking about. In medical school, they don't teach you the word unmet medical
Yeah,
needs. It's something
yeah,
I've
it's
I've
funny.
heard as I've come into industry, and I guess to a physician, it's really an intuitive thing, right? Your daily life is unmet medical needs, right? Like, how do I manage my patient's cholesterol or COPD or heart failure better? And obviously, in every situation, if you can manage the disease as effectively as possible, or treat symptoms, etc., with your medical training, that's what you're trained to do at the end of
Yeah,
the day. I find that interesting. The unmet medical needs thing is something I've really learned in the industry side of things. And yes, theoretically, that's everything you do as a physician. But here's your perspective on like how we define that, how to think about that. I'm sure some members of our audience are, in medical training, or even for those who are not, thinking about unmet medical needs, like curing a disease
yeah,
would be great. That's the unmet medical need, solve it. But I'm
yeah,
curious, like how you think about that when you're considering these problems.
yeah. No, it's a great question. So first, I'll make a comment on why I think you don't talk as much about unmet medical need. And maybe we should, but during training, physicians treat patients with the tools that they have. When you're developing drugs, you're thinking about the tools that you could have. And if you're thinking about the tools that you would like to have, that you're dreaming of having, that might make a difference, you have to think about unmet medical need. So it's uh it's a bit of a different perspective. And again, one of the reasons I love drug development, because your goal is to give more tools to physicians and more hope to patients. Unmet medical need is a fantastic topic. And, in part because it means a little bit something different, I think, to depending on who your stakeholder and your audience is. And I think it's an underappreciated concept that often leads to maybe not the best decisions with regard to drug development. And what I mean by that is, if I asked a patient, what do you think the unmet medical need is? Often it's a lot about their daily living. If it's somebody with, I don't know, a rheumatologic disease, it may be their ability to, open a can or get dressed, or, it can be very fundamental things. Physicians often think a little bit more about numbers and imaging, and something less soft in terms of whether or not there's a gap. um, and if you talk to other stakeholders, whether it's payers or investors, they've got other ideas about unmet medical need. If you talk to commercial, because a lot of that ends up also wrapping into how big is the opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. And so I I do think you have to consider all of the viewpoints, or you end up making poor decisions. You need to talk to patients to understand what is really keeping you up at night. What would you change if you could change something? And it's not the sole consideration, because physicians, I think, tend to have a little bit more of a long view, and patients tend to be more focused on, today and tomorrow, and how this is impacting me and my family and my ability to live a full life today. And they're thinking down the road without a doubt. But physicians are already often thinking about what is going to be that cumulative effect of the disease over time. So they may be focusing a little bit more on biomarkers or imaging that are reflecting what the progression of the disease is, or what could happen 10 years or 20 years down the road. And of course, you've got your investors or commercial groups that also want to make sure that you're pursuing something that ultimately is going to have enough legs to be able to get to patients, and be successful enough to be able to fund that next disease that you go after. And so that's kind of a very broad philosophically about how I think about the sort of general stakeholders and understanding unmet medical need, because it really is a combination of things from, uh, you know, um, what is the current treatment landscape? What can those drugs do, and what can't they do from a biologic standpoint? But also, are they tolerated. Maybe it's a great drug, but only 25% of patients tolerate the drug. Or maybe it's treated twice a day and people are forgetting to take their drug half the time. And so really understanding the breadth of where the gaps are that are not allowing one to get to a cure or to optimize how much you can delay progression of disease ends up being really important. It ends up being a very cross-functional activity where you need to bring together biologists and clinicians and epidemiologists, others, so that you can really characterize that unmet medical need. And maybe the last thing I'll say is you also have to have a bit of a forward-looking look, because there's also lots of drugs, often in drug development, that are progressing. And so there may be a significant unmet medical need today, but by the time you get your technology to the clinic, it could be very different. Hep C is a good example, right? I mean, um, if somebody were developing something in hepatitis C just behind Gilead or a few years behind Gilead, it may not ultimately have made any difference. So many considerations in unmet medical need, and it is a bit of can be a moving target that you need to pay attention to.
And it really makes sense to me that you have to incorporate different perspectives. Like, to your point, I can definitely see, based on my experience with patients, that they just want to live their life. They want to open the
Yeah,
can, they want to go to the gym. And,
yeah,
the patient experience and perspective is critically important to incorporate, in addition to the physician perspective as well.
yeah,
Like you said, physicians may be more, concentrated on the metrics of the disease, the progression-free survival in cancer, for example, whereas the patient might say, like, I just want to go to sleep without having any pain.
yeah,
So
exactly.
understanding those critical points early on for an entrepreneur it sounds really important. And you as a physician obviously have that perspective, and I'm sure that was very influential at your time at Chroma.
Yeah, and of course, reaching out to you end up working I de-differentiated from nephrology pretty early on. And so reaching out to physicians, and particularly if you're working in rare disease, reaching out to patient groups to really it's a fluency in understanding the disease, the gaps from a variety of different perspectives ends up being really important. You can't be insular when you're doing that sort of activity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious if you have advice for, our entrepreneurs in the audience, members of Nucleate's Activator program. Um, you know, you've been a chief medical officer and a physician, of course. You've been a CEO and on the board of directors of multiple companies. What are the most frequent challenges that you see that entrepreneurs face, or some common ones you want to talk about? And if you had any recommendations on how to handle those challenges.
Yeah, I think a lot of the challenges end up being the usual challenge of you don't know what you don't know. And um, you can, there's not always great playbooks for how to start a company and build a company, and how do you get funding, and what are the pitfalls that you can run into. It's an industry that um, where there's people with very deep experience that has been built on successes and mistakes, and and where that skill set has been honed over time. And so I think for early entrepreneurs, getting as much exposure as you can to the process with people that have been involved in the process and have had success in the process is just hugely important. Maybe not getting too far ahead of one's skis, and taking the opportunity to build a strong early foundation of experience, whether that's on the VC side in starting companies from that perspective, or on the operating side, depending on where one wants to land, or maybe a little bit of both. I mean, one of my most rewarding and fun experiences was the time I spent as a entrepreneur in residence at Atlas, where I had this opportunity to work with a number of very early companies that were making all of those early decisions. They were all in slightly different places, but they were all still sitting in an incubator space. Um, but I had this opportunity to work with these really smart people with great, interesting technology. But I also worked with multiple boards. I was also sitting on a board. I was sitting in the incubator space with the VCs, with the partners at the VC, with associates. And so I got this very broad exposure to various aspects of drug development and startups, which was hugely valuable moving forward. And I think for any, particularly young entrepreneur, networking, asking questions, and saying yes to opportunities that will give some really important exposure to the various aspects of starting a company and building a successful company, I think are just hugely important and will pay off over time. Um, Holes in that experience can lead to sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you don't get it right, but you often don't. I don't know, drug development's so hard. The more exposure you can get in these incredibly rich ecosystems like the Boston, Cambridge ecosystem, take advantage of it. There's nothing quite like it. And most people that work in this space are incredibly generous with their time and have learned a lot through successes and hard earned learnings, and are super happy and excited and willing to pass along those learnings. And so, have coffee with whoever will sit down and have coffee with you and pick their brain and listen to them, and, and build a career that way. To me, that's the fun of being young and having an opportunity to be able to really take advantage of that.
So to leverage basically the experience of all the people in Boston, Cambridge,
Yeah.
or people who've gone through it before, maybe they haven't done the exact thing that you're doing, but they've gone through a related problem and there's some nuggets of learning that you can apply to the challenge that you're facing.
Yeah, much of what we do is transferable across companies or even across, focuses. There are also many things that, to your point, are subject matter specific. And those are also really important learnings. But you can learn a lot of these transferable skills and learnings across a wide range of people, even if it's not in a very specific area that you're intending to work in. Or you may find that you want to have a different focus after you've talked to a few people that really influence you.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, you touched on your time as an entrepreneur in residence at Atlas Venture. And we've talked to Peter Barrett, so our audience is
Yeah.
likely familiar. Um, you touched on some of the aspects of the role, but I'm curious, like big picture, what does an entrepreneur in residence do? What is the role that they play? I guess maybe it's different everywhere, but maybe at
It's
Atlas, what does an EIR do? What, sounds like it's kind of a hybrid of an operating role and an investing role a little bit, like helping understand, broad spaces and what would be a differentiated technology in those, and some early company formation, navigating company formation challenges. So yeah, curious about, what does an EIR do? Let's say at Atlas specifically.
Yeah, so I laugh a little bit because when I first heard about the role, I actually couldn't quite figure out what it was. I remember going on the website, and there seemed to be a lot of them. And I really couldn't quite figure out exactly what the role does. And to your point, it means something a bit different depending on which VC that you're spending time with as an EIR. But it also means something different depending on the EIR. And so I I was, I think, maybe a little bit less of a typical EIR. So maybe I'll start with what I think is a little bit more of a typical EIR, which is often somebody who has either a business or a research background. They will often come in and they often actually come from companies that have either been sold or maybe the science didn't wasn't successful, and they will come sort of back into Atlas, and they often will spend time with multiple companies early on, providing either um, sort of a almost CSO like uh, support for maybe early on multiple companies, and then focusing on one company. But there's usually a bunch of companies in the incubator space, so you often are also providing some help if somebody taps you on the shoulder with other companies. So there's this a little bit of a collaboration that can happen between companies. On the business side, folks will often come in and provide support for everything. Almost, again, it depends a little bit on someone's experience, but it could be a CEO that's come back in that's providing strategic support to a couple of companies. They often will end up being attracted to a particular company and then become that CEO. Similarly, with somebody with more of a BD background, will provide support to a couple of different companies, but end up honing in on one and becoming, for example, a chief business officer or a head of business development. And so it's almost a little bit of a shared role early on, and then focusing more with time. I came in and functioned as essentially an interim chief medical officer for a few companies, and my role was to help think about indication selection and opportunity for the product and the technology in the context of a product. I also helped think about the commercial opportunity, given some of my experience, particularly at Amgen, and having sort of a co-leadership model with commercial. And so I felt my role was to try to bring the technology to life in the context of patients, in the context of a potential product. Um, and so it was different than a scientist who was directing the science that was happening in the lab. There was some work that I did that was real tangible. We, set up a registry, but for the most part, it was building the clinical story, and then and plans. And again, just a ton of fun, because while I did that, I also got a lot of exposure again to the early science and a lot of the strategy around fundraising, and talking with pharmaceutical companies about potential partnerships.
So to summarize, it's broad and it depends
Yeah,
on the venture firm as well as the
yeah,
individual EIR. So it sounds like you were basically part-time CMO to multiple different
yep,
companies and doing, it sounds like what you do best, which is understanding the unmet needs, building up the indication selection, and storytelling, which we've heard a couple of our guests tell us is a critical part of that early stage, fundraising process, financing, and
yep,
defining where a company, ultimately defines a strategy. If the story is compelling and has a series of steps for how you're going to create impact for multiple different types of patients, that story is critical to informing your strategy, or it's related to the strategy that you ultimately create.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, as you said early on, the technology is critically important, and without differentiated, important, and meaningful technology, you really aren't anywhere. But if there isn't an application for it that's going to allow for that meaningful change, it doesn't really matter. And bringing that story to life ends up being really important in being able to convince all of your stakeholders that it's worth the time and resources to move something forward.
Absolutely. So, speaking of early stage company storytelling and decision making, curious if you can give us an example of a hard decision that you made, whether that's strategic or personnel or otherwise, that you've made either as an EIR, as a CEO, or on the board of directors, and what was your approach to handling that?
I think the decisions that are always the hardest are the ones where you're working in ambiguity, and where your target may be moving. And so, I think for most companies in biotech right now, and in particular platform companies, one of the most challenging decisions, and it ends up being, how much should we build and scale and grow in the context of having a lot of ambiguity around what the markets will look like going forward, what the data is going to look like. Am I going to flip a card that's unexpected? So you don't want to not, you want to build for success, but you don't want to overbuild. And I think what I often struggled with the most was, how do you make I was making decisions around building the company in the context of not having any or limited visibility into what your future card flips are going to look like as you're looking at data, and what the market is going to look like in terms of raising money. And so, you do the best you can with the data that you have. And for us, we ultimately ended up making a decision to put a hold on hiring any more people, because it was clear the markets were tight and conserving cash was going to be important. I think one of the most difficult, just heart-wrenching, difficult decisions that any CEO ends up ultimately making is having to reorganize the company. And, it's a very different world right now than it was 4 or 5 years ago, where almost every company has done some amount of reorganization. And it's been, I think, it's very difficult. Personally, it's very difficult for the company culturally, and it's very difficult, I think, for the ecosystem as a whole, as these decisions end up being made. And you have to hope at the end of the day that the decisions, we ultimately ended up doing a reorganization, and that those decisions are ultimately going to allow you to bring a really promising technology forward. But they're very, very difficult decisions. And I think what helps to make those decisions and to be able to make your way through those decisions, is having a strong culture. That's so critically important in these small biotech companies. But also having um, good guidance from your board, and support as you're wrestling with decisions that can have just such a big emotional and cultural impact on a company, and can have an impact on what you can move forward.
Yeah, and to your point, it's been a challenging fundraising environment. It's been, from what I've been seeing, at Locust Walk, there's a concentration of investments into a very select
Yeah.
number of companies, that makes things challenging for the broader biotech ecosystem. And it makes sense that reorganizing and ultimately firing people is very challenging. But to quote Peter Barrett, is that failure isn't final, and neither are road bumps are natural in the field. And that I know that Atlas in the past has done a really good job of supporting people who are at their portfolio companies and making sure that they ultimately land on their feet and get new jobs.
Yeah. I think the companies, again, Chroma had and has, I think, a pretty special culture. People were really tight and continue to be tight, and really cared about each other. And so you also find that the people at the company rally around the people that get impacted during a reorganization, and help them as best they can connect with people and network with people to find new roles. And it is inspiring to see that sort of camaraderie that happens between people during those periods of time, and is something that makes you really appreciate the biotech ecosystem in Boston. It's truly is a network of people that is far broader than the company that you work in.
And it's nice to hear though that Chroma had built a really strong culture, and to the point that we've kind of talked through as a through line, is it's important to have really good science, but it's also important to have really good people who support the
Yeah.
science, and um, a good network and support system, whether it is the board of directors or outside advisors. It sounds like it's critical to
Yeah.
have a mass of ideas that are, interpreted by the leadership team and, sorted and filtered and ultimately result in storytelling and strategy to move the company forward.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Surrounding yourself by people with experience and that are supportive and um, uh, are there to help get through some of the real challenges in drug development is important, whether that's, as you point out, inside the company, whether it's your network, the board, advisors. It's takes a village.
Now, on a less serious note, when you're thinking about, you know, biotech is a often all-consuming passion, right? Like, same, I'm sure you've experienced this with medicine, is that, it's not just a, 9 to 5 kind of job. It's something that is very time consuming. It requires a whole lot of work. So, outside of, making these big decisions, um, when you have time, what are hobbies that you enjoy, that, help lighten the load a little bit, or just things that you do to get your mind off the normal day-to-day routine of work?
Yeah, so you're right. Biotech can be all consuming, and the CEO job, I have to say, is the most all consuming thing I've ever done in my life. And so you really do need to have some other areas that, that maybe take you away from the day to day. I think for me, family is really important. I spend a lot of time with my family, and I've, got a couple of fantastic kids and a great husband. And a really great extended family, and so that's important to me. Having some friends that are dear friends that you can really unwind with, super important. And then, as you're, I think, alluding to, having a few hobbies ends up being important too. When the weather's warm, I like to garden. I've got a big blueberry patch and a few fruit trees and a garden that I like to work with, and grow dahlias in the summer. So that's how I spend some of my time in the summer. I've made quilts for years. I've taken various hiatuses over time, but that's something else that I like to do. And I like to rehab houses. I don't have a lot of time to do it, but over the last number of years, um, back when you could get a deal on a house here and there. I love old houses that you can find in the Northeast and take something that you walk into and say, this place has got some amazing bones and probably some pretty cool history, and doing some work on it. My husband manages a business that we have that runs some short-term rentals, and so we've done that over the years. It's kind of a passion I have of taking a look at something and having a vision for it, and then watching and working and watching to see if you can ultimately achieve the vision that you saw when you started. So those are the few of the things that I like to do.
I would say it sounds like the through line of those hobbies is really that, growing something, right? Like with gardening
Yeah,
and, rehabbing a house, like having a vision and trying to ultimately realize that and take some time.
yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, that's I think it's definitely a general theme in my life.
Sounds like it. Definitely some parallels with biotech too, like seeing a vision, and hoping to implement it, but really good to unplug, right? Like good ways to
Yeah.
do something that, is involved, takes your mind off of, work, and something you can look at in the case of a garden that's beautiful, or, see in a house to see it transform into something that you're excited about.
It's often a little bit more immediate too. There are certain things that you can do, like I don't know, paint a few walls, and you can transform a room in a period of hours. Drug development takes a long time, and sometimes it's nice to be able to, tackle something and see the fruits of your labors in a relatively short period of time. So it's has some commonalities, but often a little bit shorter of a timeline. Although my blueberry bushes have taken many years to really grow a lot of blueberries, so not always true.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us on the Nucleate podcast. We really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. It's been a ton of fun, and I look forward to talking to you guys again in the future.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.